Have you ever noticed that strange feeling when you hear a song from your teenage years and, for just a second, your body reacts before your brain does? Your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches. You remember exactly where you were the first time you heard it, even if you can't remember what you ate yesterday. You might even feel a little confused about why it hits you so hard. Too old to be nostalgic the way millennials are. Too young to feel like a full-blown Gen Xer. You don't quite fit the labels, yet you feel deeply shaped by something specific. If that sounds familiar, you might be a Xennial, and your psychology tells a fascinating story. Xennials, usually born between 1976 and 1985, grew up straddling two worlds that rarely get talked about together. You remember a time before the internet ruled everything, but you also adapted to it early enough that it didn't feel alien. You played outside until the streetlights came on, but you also learned how to type fast because suddenly that mattered. You remember the sound of dial-up internet, but you also remember the thrill of realizing you could look anything up instantly. And that in-between experience didn't just shape your habits. It shaped how your brain learned to deal with change, uncertainty, and identity itself. Psychologically speaking, Xennials grew up during a transition period that trained their nervous systems in a very particular way. Early childhood for many of you was relatively analog, slower, and more predictable. Information came from parents, teachers, TV schedules, libraries. You waited for answers. You tolerated boredom. Your brain learned patience first. Then, right as adolescence or young adulthood hit, the world started speeding up. Technology exploded. Jobs shifted. Cultural values started changing faster than social rules could keep up, and your brain had to adapt on the fly. This creates a unique psychological blend. On one hand, there's a deep comfort with self-reliance. Many Xennials were latchkey kids to some degree, trusted to manage their own time, emotions, and problems earlier than generations that came after. That builds a strong internal locus of control, the belief that your actions matter, that you can figure things out. On the other hand, there's a constant low-level tension because the rules you learned early on kept changing. Just when you thought you understood how life worked, the goalposts moved. That tension shows up everywhere. In how Xennials approach work, relationships, and even happiness. You might notice that you're adaptable, but also tired of adapting. You can learn new systems, new technologies, new expectations, but part of you quietly resents that you always have to. Psychologically, this is what happens when a brain is trained to be flexible without being given much emotional scaffolding for that flexibility. You learned to cope, not necessarily to rest. There's also the emotional tone of growing up in a time that emphasized independence over emotional expression. Many Xennials internalized the idea that being low maintenance was a virtue. You didn't want to be a burden, you didn't want to need too much. So you learned to self-soothe, self-entertain, and self-regulate early. That's a strength, but it comes with a cost. Research on emotional development shows that when children learn competence before emotional validation, they often grow into adults who are capable but quietly disconnected from their own needs. That might explain why so many Xennials feel emotionally articulate, yet emotionally restrained. You can talk about feelings, but you're selective about when and with whom. You're empathetic, but you don't always feel comfortable asking for empathy in return. You're the friend people lean on, the one who has it together even when you're not entirely sure how that happened. Another defining psychological feature of Xennials is your relationship with time. You experienced life before everything was optimized, tracked, and quantified. There were fewer metrics for success, fewer constant comparisons. Then social media arrived, and suddenly everyone's life was visible, editable, and shareable. Your brain had already formed a sense of self before that shift, which is protective. Studies suggest that identity formation before constant social comparison reduces vulnerability to external validation. But you're not immune. You still feel the pressure, you just remember a time when it didn't exist, and that contrast can feel exhausting. This is where the famous Xennial cynicism comes from. It's not negativity for its own sake. It's pattern recognition. You've seen trends come and go, promises made and broken, systems hailed as revolutionary and then quietly abandoned. Your brain learned skepticism as a survival skill. Optimism felt risky. Hope learned to come with footnotes. And yet, beneath that skepticism, there's often a surprising amount of idealism. You still care deeply about meaning, fairness, and authenticity. You just don't trust slogans. Neuroscience helps explain this push and pull. The brain's reward system is shaped by early experiences of effort and payoff. Many Xennials grew up with delayed gratification as the norm. You waited for your favorite show to come on. You saved up for things. You worked through boredom. Then adulthood introduced instant rewards everywhere. Notifications, likes, streaming, fast feedback. For a brain trained on waiting, that can feel both intoxicating and unsettling. You enjoy convenience, but part of you misses depth. This shows up in relationships too. Xennials often value emotional depth and loyalty, but struggle with modern dating dynamics that emphasize speed and disposability. You remember when relationships grew slowly, when social circles overlapped, when disappearing without explanation wasn't normalized. Your psychology craves continuity, even as you've learned to function in a fragmented world. That mismatch can create a quiet sense of grief you don't always have words for. There's also something important to say about humor. Xennial humor is often dry, self-aware, and slightly dark. Psychologically, humor like this functions as emotional regulation. It allows you to acknowledge pain without being consumed by it. Studies on coping mechanisms suggest that this kind of humor is linked to resilience, especially in people who learned early that expressing distress directly wasn't always welcomed. You joke not because things don't matter, but because they matter too much to carry raw. Work identity is another area where Xennial psychology stands out. You were raised with the idea that work equals worth, but you've lived long enough to see that equation fail many times. Layoffs, economic crashes, shifting industries. You adapted, but your nervous system remembers the instability. That's why many Xennials oscillate between ambition and burnout. You want meaning in your work, not just survival, but you also fear tying your identity too tightly to something that can disappear overnight. Interestingly, this makes Xennials especially good at mentoring. You can translate between generations because you've lived the transition. You understand analog thinking and digital logic. You can empathize with younger people's anxiety without dismissing it, and you can respect older perspectives without romanticizing them. Psychologically, you function as a bridge, and that role, while often unrecognized, is deeply valuable. There's also a subtle existential layer to Xennial psychology. Growing up at the edge of major cultural shifts often creates a heightened awareness of impermanence. You saw how quickly norms could change, how identities could be rewritten. That can create anxiety, but it can also create wisdom. You're less likely to assume that the way things are now is the way they'll always be. That awareness can fuel adaptability, creativity, and a deeper appreciation for the present moment. At the same time, it can make rest feel undeserved. Many Xennials struggle with the feeling that if they stop moving, they'll fall behind. This is partly a nervous system issue. When you grow up adapting to change, your body learns to stay alert. Calm can feel unfamiliar. Rest can feel like laziness. Understanding this is powerful because it reframes exhaustion not as a personal failure, but as a learned response. Here's the quiet truth about Xennials. You're not broken for feeling caught between worlds. Your brain was literally shaped by transition. You learned to hold contradictions, optimism and skepticism, independence and longing, adaptability and fatigue. That's not confusion. That's complexity. And complexity in psychology is often a sign of maturity. If you're a Xennial, your task isn't to pick a side or finally fit into a generational box. It's to integrate what you've learned, to allow yourself the emotional care you didn't always receive, to recognize that your resilience doesn't require constant proof, to let yourself rest without needing to justify it. And if you're not a Xennial, but you recognize someone you love in this description, maybe this gives you a new lens. Beneath the sarcasm, the competence, the quiet endurance, there's a nervous system that learned early and adapted fast. There's depth there. There's history there. So the next time you feel that strange ache when an old song comes on, or that quiet frustration with how fast everything moves, or that pull toward meaning over noise, pause for a moment. That feeling isn't random. It's your psychology remembering where it came from. And understanding that story doesn't trap you in the past. It gives you permission to move forward with more kindness toward yourself. If this resonated with you, take a moment to sit with it. Maybe share your experience in the comments. Or stick around and keep exploring how psychology shapes the way we move through the world. Because understanding your mind isn't about fixing yourself. It's about finally seeing yourself clearly.